If we take the height of Mount Everest, we would still have about a mile of water above us before we get to the ocean's surface. Spend a lot of time and effort developing submarine hunting technology.
There is a place on this planet that has never once felt a ray of sunlight. Not for a single second, not in all the time the Earth has existed. It sits nearly 7 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific, buried under a column of water so heavy that if you tried to stand there without protection, your body would be gone before your brain even registered what happened. For most of human history, we assumed that place was empty, a frozen, crushed, lightless wasteland where nothing could possibly survive. Then a camera went down there, the lights switched on, and what came back up changed the way an entire field of science looks at the ocean floor. This is the story of that footage, the place it came from, and the uncomfortable questions it left behind. To understand why this discovery hit so hard, you first have to understand exactly where it happened. The Mariana Trench is not simply a deep patch of ocean. It is a wound carved into the crust of the Earth itself, formed where the enormous Pacific tectonic plate is slowly forced downward beneath the smaller Mariana plate. This process, called subduction, has been grinding away for tens of millions of years, and over that unimaginable stretch of time it has hollowed out the deepest known point on the surface of our planet. The numbers alone are hard to hold in your head. If you took Mount Everest, the tallest mountain above sea level on Earth, and dropped it into the deepest part of this trench, its summit would still sit more than a mile underwater. An entire Everest, swallowed, with a mile of ocean left over above the peak. That is the kind of depth we are talking about, a place so far down that comparing it to a mountain almost undersells it. At the very bottom, in a section known as the Challenger Deep, the pressure is more than 1,000 times what we experience standing on land. It is a force strong enough to crush a submarine's steel hull like a soda can if a single seal fails. The temperature hovers just above freezing, and it stays that way permanently, with no seasons, no storms, no warmth ever passing through. And the darkness is total. Sunlight stops penetrating seawater at around 3,300 feet. The floor of this trench lies almost 10 times deeper than that. It is not simply dark the way a moonless night is dark. It is a darkness so complete that opening or closing your eyes makes no difference whatsoever. Because nothing that photosynthesizes can live in a place with no light. There are no plants down there, no algae, none of the base level producers that most food chains on Earth depend on. Whatever nutrients exist have to fall from far above, drifting down as flakes of dead organic material that scientists call marine snow. A creature that dies near the surface can take days to sink all the way to the bottom, and by the time it arrives there is very little of it left. Crushing pressure, freezing cold, absolute blackness, and only scraps of food raining down from a world the ocean floor will never see. It is easy to understand why, for so long, scientists gave this layer of the ocean a name borrowed from mythology. They called it the Hadal Zone, after Hades, the ancient underworld. We named it after the land of the dead before we had ever managed to look at it properly. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, the leading minds in oceanography agreed on one thing. The deep sea was essentially barren. Early attempts to sample the ocean floor involved dragging heavy dredges along the bottom and hauling them back up to see what they contained. Time after time, those dredges came back with little more than cold mud and sediment. No complex animals, no obvious signs of a thriving ecosystem. Every empty hole reinforced the same conclusion. The deep ocean, they decided, was a drowned desert, and there was nothing left to discover down there worth the enormous cost and risk of looking further. In 1960, two men briefly challenged that belief. Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh piloted a bathyscaphe called the Treece down to the floor of the Challenger Deep, becoming the first human beings to ever reach the deepest point on Earth. They reported seeing what looked like living creatures resting on the seafloor. But the cameras and lighting equipment of that era were far too limited to capture anything clear enough to convince the wider scientific community. Without solid photographic proof, the claim was treated as an interesting footnote rather than a turning point, and the belief that the deep sea was essentially lifeless held firm for years afterward. That belief didn't really begin to crack until the technology caught up. Starting in the 1970s, remotely operated vehicles and pressure-rated submersibles began reaching depths that had previously been impossible to study directly. Then, in 1977, researchers made a discovery that reshaped an entire branch of biology. Deep on the ocean floor, They found hydrothermal vents, cracks in the crust where mineral-rich water heated far below the seabed poured out into the freezing water above. Clustered around those vents were entire communities of organisms, tube worms, crabs, strange pale fish, all thriving without a single trace of sunlight anywhere near them. This forced scientists to accept something genuinely strange. Some organisms don't need sunlight at all. Through a process called chemosynthesis, certain bacteria can build usable energy directly from chemical reactions, and entire food webs can be built on top of that foundation instead of on photosynthesis. It was a profound shift, and it should have served as a warning. Every time researchers drew a hard line and said life could not possibly exist beyond it, the ocean had already crossed that line, quietly, patiently, without waiting for permission. Still, one enormous question stayed unanswered. Every one of these vent discoveries occurred at depths of around 20 to 25,000 feet. Deep, yes, but nowhere close to the true bottom of the trenches. What lived even farther down, in the Hadal Zone itself, in the true abyss where Pickard and Walsh had briefly glimpsed something decades earlier, remained a near total blank. The tools of the time simply could not survive down there long enough, or see clearly enough, to answer the question. That gap in our knowledge stayed sealed for decades, until one man decided to close it himself. In 2019, an American explorer and former naval officer named Victor Vescovo launched an ambitious project called the 5 Deeps Expedition, with the goal of piloting a submersible to the deepest point of every ocean on Earth. The most difficult target on that list, by far, was the Challenger Deep, the same trench that had defeated or limited nearly everyone who had tried to study it before. What made this attempt different was the vehicle itself. Vescovo's submersible, the DSV limiting factor, had been engineered specifically to endure the crushing pressure of the deepest parts of the ocean, and to do so repeatedly rather than as a single historic stunt. Mounted on its hull was high-definition camera equipment capable of capturing sharp, detailed footage even in total darkness, something no expedition to this depth had ever carried before. The descent itself takes nearly 4 hours. Passengers describe watching the bright blue light near the surface fade gradually into a deep twilight, and then, within minutes, into a blackness so complete that pressing a hand against the viewport reveals nothing at all. There is no sound beyond the low hum of the life support systems and the occasional creak of the vehicle adjusting to the growing pressure outside. By the time the submersible finally reaches the bottom, at a depth of nearly 36,000 feet, the pressure outside the hull has climbed past 16,000 pounds per square inch. At that pressure, a single structural failure would not injure a human being. It would end a life in a fraction of a second, with no warning and no possibility of rescue. There is no team that can follow you down to that depth if something goes wrong. You are, in a very real sense, farther from help than almost any human being has ever been. Over the course of the expedition, Vescovo completed multiple dives past 33,000 feet, each one a repeat of that same 4-hour descent, hours spent on the bottom gathering footage, and another 4-hour ascent back to the surface. Waiting on the support ship above, watching the video feeds come in real time, was the expedition's chief scientist, a deep-sea biologist named Alan Jameson, who had spent much of his career studying the Hadal Zone specifically, the same layer of ocean that most of his colleagues still quietly dismissed as scientifically uninteresting. When the footage finally reached his monitors, he did what any careful scientist would do. He watched it closely, checked it against everything he expected to see, and prepared to be disappointed by an empty, silent sea flue. What came through on those screens did not match anyone's expectations. If life existed at these depths at all, the working assumption was that it would be rare, a single stray organism, an occasional lucky survivor scattered across an otherwise empty plain. Instead, the moment the lights hit the bottom, the frame filled with movement. The first creatures to appear were amphipods, small shrimp-like scavengers, and they arrived in numbers nobody had predicted. As soon as bait was introduced into the water, they swarmed it so thickly that they stopped looking like individual animals altogether and became something closer to a living cloud, churning and shifting as they competed for food. For a scientist expecting a barren sea flue, watching a feeding frenzy like that unfold in real time was nothing short of stunning. This wasn't a handful of survivors clinging to existence. This was abundance. Soon after, the cameras picked up sea cucumbers, moving slowly and calmly across the mud, feeding exactly the way their shallow water relatives do. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that these animals were barely enduring some kind of biological nightmare. They looked entirely at home, going about an ordinary routine in what we had always assumed was the single most hostile environment on the planet. That calm, unremarkable behavior turned out to be one of the most unsettling details of the entire expedition, because it suggested these animals weren't surviving the trench. They were simply living in it, the way any other creature lives in its own native habitat. The sheer quantity of life was the first surprise. The diversity was the second, and in some ways it was the more important one. This wasn't a single hardy species clinging on alone. The footage showed multiple distinct types of amphipods, some slender and fast, others bulkier and slower, along with several different varieties of sea cucumber, each apparently occupying its own niche. Worms, isopods, and other small invertebrates that had rarely if ever been documented at this depth turned up as well, each going about its own business. None of these organisms appeared to be isolated from one another. Scavengers worked through the falling scraps of dead material. Filter feeders extracted nutrients directly from the water column. Predators hunted the smaller animals moving around them. In other words, this wasn't just scattered survival. It was a functioning food web, layered and interconnected, with different species apparently filling different ecological roles. Building a system this complex, this balanced, does not happen quickly. It takes an enormous amount of time for a community like this to develop, generation after generation, specializing and dividing up the available resources. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How long has this been happening, quietly, in the one place on Earth we assumed was empty? If these communities have existed for thousands or even millions of years, then what the cameras captured wasn't a fragile fluke barely surviving at the edge of possibility. It was one of the oldest and most stable ecosystems on the planet, operating in complete secrecy the entire time, while generations of scientists confidently insisted there was nothing down there to study. There was one more assumption still standing, and the footage demolished that one too. Even if life turned out to be abundant and varied, the reasonable expectation was that it would be slow, sluggish, conserving every last scrap of energy in a place with so little food and such extreme cold. Instead, the amphipods moved with real speed and aggression, shoving past one another to reach food the instant it appeared, behaving less like animals rationing their last reserves and more like confident, opportunistic predators. Fish moving through the same frame swam smoothly and easily, with none of the sluggishness anyone expected from an organism living under 1,000 atmospheres of pressure in near-freezing water. And then there was the matter of size. The amphipods recorded during the expedition were reaching 6 to 8 inches in length, several times larger than their shallow water relatives. Stranger still was a fish, the deep-sea snailfish, measuring 8 to 10 inches long, with a soft, faintly translucent body that seemed to drift through the camera lights rather than swim through them. By every rule biologists had assumed applied at this depth, an animal like that should have been crushed flat. Instead, it moved through the water calmly, fully intact, gliding through conditions that would instantly destroy a steel cylinder. The explanation, once researchers worked it out, turns out to be quieter and stranger than any exotic alien biology. These animals are made almost entirely of water, and water barely compresses under pressure. That means the pressure inside their bodies stays nearly matched to the pressure pressing in from outside. So instead of being crushed, they exist in a kind of constant equilibrium with their environment. The finer details happen at the cellular level. Their proteins are structured to hold their shape under conditions that would deform ours. Their cell membranes contain specialized fats that stay flexible in the cold instead of stiffening. Their enzymes continue functioning normally in conditions that would shut down equivalent processes in shallow water animals. None of this required evolving some entirely new form of biology. It required only small, precise adjustments to the same basic biological machinery every living thing on Earth already relies on. Life, it turns out, doesn't need to reinvent itself to conquer an environment like this. It only needs to bend in a few very specific places. Here is where the story stops being simply remarkable and starts becoming genuinely unsettling, and it's important to be careful and honest about this part. The submersibles lights only ever illuminated a small bubble of water directly in front of the camera. Beyond that narrow radius, the darkness was, and remains, absolute. Several times during the expedition, researchers reviewing the footage noticed the sediment on the seafloor shifting slightly, as if something had passed through moments earlier, without ever clearly entering the frame. In a handful of shots, indistinct shapes appeared at the very edge of the light, before sliding away into blackness the instant the camera seemed to turn toward them. To be completely clear, there is no confirmed evidence of some undiscovered monster lurking in the trench. Those shifting shadows could easily be explained by silt disturbed by current, or simple visual artifacts created by a single light source surrounded by total darkness. Nobody involved in this research claims otherwise, and it would be dishonest to suggest they do. But here is what has genuinely changed. For generations, any unusual sonar return or unexplained shape at extreme depth was automatically dismissed, because the scientific consensus held that there was essentially nothing alive down there capable of producing it. That automatic dismissal no longer holds up quite so comfortably. Now that we've directly observed complex, fast-moving, unexpectedly large organisms thriving on that seafloor, the assumption that anything unusual must be nothing at all deserves a little more scrutiny than it used to get. Consider the scale of what we're actually working with. The Mariana Trench stretches for more than 1,500 miles along the seafloor, a canyon longer than most countries. The handful of expeditions that have ever filmed its deepest sections have produced, in total, only a few hundred hours of footage, illuminating what amounts to a series of pinpricks of light scattered across an enormous, permanently dark landscape. If 8 to 10-inch creatures can live comfortably down there, and if the amphipods already grow several times larger than their shallow water cousins, it raises a fair question rather than a sensational one. Where exactly is the upper limit on size in this environment? And has anything ever happened to wander close enough to one of our few brief lights to show us? There's another puzzle buried inside all of this, one that nobody has fully solved yet. If the trench floor is genuinely this crowded and this active, something has to be feeding all of it, and the math doesn't currently add up. The falling scraps of marine snow, the slow drift of dead organic material from the surface, simply doesn't provide enough energy to support a population this dense and this energetic. The amount of food arriving from above and the amount of life apparently sustained by it don't balance. Chemosynthesis at hydrothermal vents might explain part of the picture, but vents haven't been located everywhere throughout the trench, so that alone can't account for everything researchers observed. It's possible there are additional energy sources scientists haven't identified yet, chemical processes happening in the sediment that remain completely undocumented. It's also possible, and this may be the most interesting explanation of all, that the deep ocean simply recycles energy far more efficiently than ecosystems near the surface, passing nutrients through the system repeatedly with very little waste, allowing far more life to be sustained on far less raw material than anyone assumed was possible. The honest answer is that researchers don't yet know for certain. We have detailed, high-resolution footage of a thriving ecosystem, and we still can't fully explain what keeps it running. There is one last discovery from this expedition, and in some ways it may be the most sobering of all. When Vescovo's submersible finally settled onto the floor of the Challenger Deep, the cameras picked out a plastic bag resting in the silt, along with what appeared to be a candy wrapper. Nearly 7 miles down, in what should have been the single most untouched, unreachable place on the entire planet, human trash was already waiting there, and it had clearly arrived long before the submersible did. The story gets worse at the microscopic level. When researchers later examined amphipods collected from this same environment, several of them were found to contain microplastic particles inside their bodies.